cabin Patrick Doyle built in Shasta County in 1858 was a standard board frame structure for the California mining country of that period. 12 feet by 14 feet, walls of 1-inch ponderosa pine from the Shasta City Mill, a low-pitched roof of the same material covered with split shingles, a single door on the south wall, one window on the east. Patrick had built it in the summer between his second and third seasons of placer mining on the Sacramento River tributaries, when he had accumulated enough from the gravel bars to pay for milled lumber and to feel that the tent he had been living in since 1852 was no longer adequate. He built it alone in 6 weeks, which was fast work for a man without carpentry training, and the result was serviceable rather than precise. The corners were close to square, the roof shed water adequately, the floor was the bare soil of the Shasta County foothills, packed firm by years of foot traffic. Agnes Hartley arrived from Ohio in 1855, 3 years before the cabin was built, which meant she had spent 3 years in the tent before she had 4 walls of pine around her. She did not complain about this. She had known what she was coming to when she bought the passage to San Francisco and the stage ticket north to Shasta City in response to Patrick's letter of February 1855. The letter had described the situation accurately: a tent, a gravel claim on a creek tributary, reasonable prospects, a man who would be glad of company and who was sending the passage money because he meant what he said in the letter of the previous year. She had read it, packed her trunk, and come. The tent was what it was. The cabin that came 3 years later was an improvement she received without surprise, because she had expected it in approximately that time. They lived in the cabin for 10 years, which was longer than most of the mining families in Shasta County managed to stay in one place. Patrick moved from placer to hydraulic to drift mining as the easy surface gold depleted and the methods became more capital intensive and more dangerous. And in 1865 he joined a drift mining operation in the hills north of the creek that was paying reasonable wages to experienced men who would work underground. Agnes ran the farm they had put together from Patrick's accumulated earnings, 25 acres in the Sacramento Valley foothills, chickens for milk cows, a kitchen garden that fed them through the summer, and, in good years, produced enough surplus to sell at the Shasta City market. Patrick died in 1868. The drift mine had a timber failure in the 3rd level, and the collapse came before the men on that level could reach the shaft. He was 43. Agnes Nee Hartley was 40. Their sons, Thomas, 22, and James, 19, were both in Sacramento by then. Thomas working as a printer's apprentice, and James reading law in the office of an attorney on K Street. They came home for the burial and stayed 2 weeks, and asked Agnes whether she wanted to come to Sacramento. She said she did not. The farm was producing adequately. She knew the county. She knew the neighbors. She would manage. She managed for 3 years without significant structural problem. The cabin Patrick had built in 1858 was aging in the way that board frame structures aged in the Shasta County winters. The lower courses of the north and west walls, where the winter moisture ran off the roof and pooled against the base of the boards, had softened and darkened by 1869, and by 1870 the softening had become actual decay. She could push a finger into the lower 8 inches of the north wall in several places and feel the wood give. The upper boards were still sound. The roof framing was sound, but the base of the north wall was failing, and a wall that was failing at the base was a wall that would eventually fail entirely. She considered her options in the summer of 1870 with the specific attention she gave to practical problems that had a finite set of solutions. The options were 3. She could hire carpenters to replace the failed boards and reframe the base of the north wall, which would address the immediate problem but not the underlying cause. And the underlying cause, winter moisture against pine boards, would produce the same failure again in 5 to 8 years. She could tear down the pine cabin and build a new one of the same design with better quality lumber and a wider overhang to keep the moisture off the base boards, which would cost more than she had liquid at the time and would produce a structure with the same fundamental vulnerability. Or she could build something different. She had been thinking about something different since 1867. When she had visited the homestead of a Wintu family in the hills north of the creek and had seen the way they built their winter structures. The winter house in the North California hills was a semi-subterranean structure, a shallow pit dug into the hillside, with a frame of bent poles rising from the pit edges and curving to meet at the top, the whole frame covered with bark sheets and earth. The resulting structure was roughly hemispherical, low, wide, earth-covered, with an entrance at one end. From a distance it looked like a low mound. From close up it was a house. Agnes had spent an hour examining one of these structures in 1867 with the permission of the family who used it, and what she understood from the examination was primarily about the roof. The bent pole frame carried the weight of the earth covering not by resisting it, as a flat surface would resist it, fighting the load directly, but by redirecting it. The curve of the poles meant that the weight of the earth on the outside of the curve produced compression along the length of the pole rather than bending across it, and compression along a pole's length was a load it could carry almost indefinitely, while bending across its length was a load that would eventually break it. The arch form, any arch form, whether bent pole or cut stone, worked by turning vertical load into lateral thrust, pushing outward at the base rather than pressing down at the center. The Wintu builders had arrived at this form through a tradition she could not trace, but the physics of why it worked were the same physics that governed any arch. She was not an engineer. She did not use the word compression or the phrase lateral thrust, but she understood, from looking at the structure and thinking about what she saw, that the curved roof worked in a way that the flat roof of Patrick's cabin did not, and that the difference was relevant to the problem she was trying to solve. The structure she built in the summer of 1871 was not a winter house. It was a synthesis of what she had seen and what she had available and what she needed. She had the pine boards from Patrick's cabin. The upper boards were sound, and she pulled them carefully from the frame, saving every piece that was usable. She had the soil of the low hillside, 30 feet north of the cabin site, a dense red clay loam that cut into even sod blocks with her spade. She had the summer before the next winter. She had no money to spare and no inclination to ask her sons for any. She designed the structure by drawing it in the soil with a stick before she broke ground. A rectangle 10 feet wide by 16 feet long. Walls of sod blocks 18 inches thick, rising 4 feet from the ground. She had seen enough sod construction in the accounts of the Kansas and Nebraska settlers in the agricultural papers she read to know that sod blocks properly laid, grass side down, dried into a wall of considerable density and strength. The roof would be the pine boards from the old cabin, each board attached at both wall tops and bent into an arc, not a gentle slope but a true half circle. The boards acting as ribs of a barrel, meeting at a central ridge beam at the top of the arc. The ridge beam would sit 7 feet above the floor at the center of the 10-foot span. The boards would be covered first with a layer of pine boughs, then with 6 inches of the same sod that formed the walls. The result, if it worked as she intended, would be a structure that looked from outside like a long earthen mound with a door in one end, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall at the ridge, 16 feet long, with walls that were 18 inches of compressed earth on every side, and a roof that was 6 inches of sod over pine ribs in a barrel arch. It would be small. Ezra Webb's cabin was 20 by 22 feet. The Henderson place was 18 by 20. Agnes's new structure would be 160 square feet against their 400 plus. It would look like something a person built because they had no better option. She broke ground in June of 1871 and worked through the summer. The sod came from the hillside above the site in blocks 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches deep, cut with the long-handled spade and carried down to the building site, 2 at a time in a canvas sling. She laid them grass side down in courses, each course offset from the one below, the way she had seen described in the Kansas accounts. The weight of each course compressed the one below. By the time the walls reached 4 feet, 12 courses, the lower courses were already consolidating into something denser than the original sod. The ridge beam was the hardest part. It was a straight piece of 6-inch ponderosa, timber 16 feet long, that she had bought from the Shasta City mill at the specific cost of $4.60, which was the only money she spent on the construction. She raised it on 2 posts, one at each end of the building, that she set in the ground 4 feet deep and tamped firm with the blunt end of the hammer handle. The ridge beam sat atop the posts at 7 feet above the floor, running the length of the building along its center line. The ribs were the pine boards from the old cabin. She had 42 usable boards of varying lengths, most of them around 8 feet. She trimmed them to consistent lengths and bent them across the span from wall-top to wall-top, each board arching over the ridge beam at the center. Pine bends without splitting if the bend is gradual relative to the board's length. A board that is 8 feet long can be bent across a 5-foot span without breaking if the curve is distributed evenly. which she achieved by soaking the boards in the creek for 2 days before placing them. She nailed each board to the wall top on both sides and to the ridge beam at the center, so that each rib was fixed at 3 points. She spaced the ribs 8 inches apart along the 16-foot length, which gave her 24 ribs and a surface that covered the span completely. Over the ribs she laid pine boughs from the cut ponderosa logs, overlapping like shingles, building up a layer that would hold the sod above the board surface and prevent it from falling through the gaps. Then the sod, 6 inches of it, laid across the bow surface, the same way she had laid the wall courses. Grass side up on the outside, the root structure of the grass, holding the sod layer together on the curved surface. She wet it down after placement and let it dry for 2 weeks before she considered the roof finished. The total weight of the sod roof, 6 inches of wet sod over a 10 by 16 surface, was approximately 4,000 pounds. The arched rib structure carried this weight, has compression along each rib, and transferred it to the sod walls at the base, where the walls transferred it to the ground. There was no central beam carrying a bending load. There was no flat span flexing under distributed weight. The load traveled in the direction the arch directed it, which was down and outward along curves into the earth. This was the same principle the Roman builders had used in their stone arches and the Gothic masons in their vaulted ceilings. Arrived at independently by a woman in Shasta County who had looked at a winter house in 1867 and understood what she saw. Ezra Webb came by in August of 1871 when the structure was half complete, walls up, ridge beam in place, the first ribs going across. He looked at it for a moment and said it looked like a burial mound. He meant it as an observation, not a specific insult, but the observation had the quality of an assessment that found the object wanting, and Agnes heard it as such. She said, "It will be warmer than your place in January." He said, "You could have asked Thomas and James for the lumber money." She said, "I didn't need to." He looked at the half-complete ribs and the sod walls and said nothing further and rode away. His wife Martha came by 2 weeks later and asked Agnes directly, "You're not going to live in that over the winter, are you?" Agnes said, "Yes." Martha said, "It seems very small." Agnes said, "It heats faster than a large one." Martha said she supposed that was true and went home. The Shasta City merchant who handled Agnes's egg and cream sales saw her in September when she came into town and asked about the construction he had heard about. She described it. He said he had never heard of a sod house with an arched roof in California. She said she had not heard of one either. He said, "What made you think it would work?" She said, "I looked at how the Winters build their winter houses." He said, "The Indians?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I suppose they know the Winters here." She said, "They've been here longer than we have." She moved into the new structure in October of 1871. When the interior was finished, a board floor over the packed earth, a small cast iron stove against the north end, connected to a stovepipe that exited through the south wall below the arch of the ribs, a sleeping platform on the west side, a work surface on the east. The space was small, 160 square feet against the 268 of Patrick's cabin, but the stove, which had been adequate to heat the larger space on moderate winter days and inadequate on the coldest ones, now heated the smaller space to 70 degrees in 40 minutes from a cold start and held 65 without difficulty through the night on a modest load of oak. She recorded the temperature on the mornings before she lit the stove, a habit she had started in 1869 when she had begun tracking the cabin's performance through the winter. The pine cabin's coldest recorded morning temperature from December 1869 had been 31 degrees. In the new structure, the coldest morning temperature in the first winter, December 1871 through March 1872, was 44 degrees. The difference was the walls. 18 inches of consolidated sod against 1 inch of pine board was a comparison that showed directly in the morning temperature before the first fire. The wood consumption tracked with this. In the pine cabin, she had burned approximately 3.5 cords of mixed hardwood through the winter of 1869–70, which was a normal season. In the new structure she burned 2 cords through the winter of 1871–72, which included the January blizzard. The reduction was partly the smaller volume to heat, and partly the better insulation. She had 3.5 cords cut and split for the first winter, expecting a consumption similar to the previous years, and she ended February with nearly 1.25 cords remaining. The January blizzard arrived on the 15th of 1872 and continued for 4 days. Shasta County at 2,000 feet in the Sacramento Valley foothills received 28 inches of snow over those 4 days, with a northwest wind that packed the snow against every north-facing surface. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees on the night of the 17th. Agnes tracked the storm the same way she tracked everything. She went outside at 6 in the morning and at noon and at 4 in the afternoon to observe the conditions, noted the temperature on the board thermometer outside the south door, and came back inside. On the morning of the 16th, she noted that the snow was sliding off the arched roof in sheets. The curved surface gave the accumulated snow no flat purchase, and the weight of the new snow pushed the old snow down the curve and off the edge, where it piled against the base of the walls. The walls were 18 inches thick. The snow piling against them added insulation rather than structural load. The arch above was carrying only the 6 inches of sod that was frozen into the roof structure. The new snow had slid clear. She also noted, on the morning of the 17th, that she could hear the Webb's roof. Ezra Webb's cabin was 200 yards to the east, close enough that in still conditions she could sometimes hear sounds from his place. What she heard on the morning of the 17th was a cracking sound that she recognized from the way green timber sounds when it is stressed. Past its capacity, a slow pop, and then a sustained creak, the sound of wood bending under load it was not built for. She heard it at 6 in the morning and again at 9. She put on her coat and hat and went outside, and stood in the snow looking toward the Webb place, and could see, even at that distance and in the falling snow, that the ridgeline of the cabin roof was no longer straight. It had a depression at the center, the specific sag of a ridge beam that has flexed under accumulated load. She went inside and waited. At noon, Ezra came to her door with Martha and their 2 younger children. The roof had come in at the ridge, not a full collapse, but the central beam had cracked under the snow load, and the ridge had dropped 8 inches, opening a gap at the center of the roof, through which snow was now falling directly into the cabin. They could not stay in it. Agnes opened the door and said, "Come in." The 4 Webbs and Agnes were in the 160-square-foot space for 2 days, while Ezra and his eldest son went back to the Webb cabin twice daily to shore up the failed beam with posts and nail boards over the gap. The space was small for 5 people. The stove kept it at 62 degrees through the blizzard nights. On the evening of the first day, when the children were asleep on the platform and Ezra and Martha were sitting by the stove with Agnes, Ezra said, "The arch didn't come in." She said, "No." He said, "The snow slides off it." She said, "Yes." He said, "I said it looked like a burial mound." She said, "It does look like a burial mound." He said, "It held up better than mine." She said, "The arch distributes the weight differently than a flat roof." He said he didn't entirely follow that. She said, "A flat roof fights the snow by being strong enough to hold it. The arch redirects the snow's weight into the walls. The walls are sod, they're strong in compression." He said, "And the snow slides off." She said, "And the snow slides off." Martha Webb said, "How did you know to build it that way?" Agnes said, "I saw the Winters building their winter houses in the hills. Their roofs are the same shape. They have been through more Shasta County winters than anyone else here." Martha looked at the curved ceiling above them, the pine ribs in their arc, the sod between them, the warmth that the small stove was maintaining against the storm outside. She said, "It's warmer in here than my kitchen in October." Agnes said, "The walls are thicker." Ezra built a new cabin in the spring of 1872. He replaced the failed ridge beam and repaired the roof. But the experience had changed what he thought a cabin in Shasta County needed. The new ridge beam was heavier. He added 2 intermediate posts under the ridge. He did not build an arched roof. He did not have the materials or the inclination to start from the winter principle the way Agnes had, but he reinforced the flat roof with the lesson the January blizzard had provided. Agnes observed the reconstruction from a distance and thought it was an adequate response to the specific failure, but not the full response that the underlying principle suggested. She did not say this to Ezra. She stayed in the barrel vault sod structure until 1881, when Thomas and James convinced her to come to Sacramento. By then the structure had been through 9 Shasta County winters. The sod walls had consolidated over the years into something harder than the original cut blocks. The clay fraction had dried and re-wetted, and dried again through 9 seasonal cycles, and had become almost ceramic in density. She had done nothing to maintain the structure in 9 years, except resod one section of the roof in 1874, where the original sod layer had thinned. The pine ribs were sound. The ridge beam was sound. The sod walls were harder than when she built them. Thomas came to help her pack and moved to Sacramento in the spring of 1881 and spent 2 days at the Shasta County property before they left. He walked around the structure twice and looked at it carefully, the way a man trained in practical trades looks at something he wants to understand. He said, "It hasn't moved." She said, "No." He said, "The ribs are still set at the same angle." She said, "Yes." He said, "How?" She said, "The arch carries the load without flexing." He said, "A flat roof would have moved." She said, "A flat roof would have moved in the first winter." He said, "Ezra's did." She said, "Yes." Thomas looked at the structure for another moment. He said, "You got this from the winters." She said, "From watching how they built." He said, "Did you tell them?" She said, "Tell them what?" He said, "That you used their method." She said, "I imagined they would consider it obvious that a building should have an arched roof and not a flat one." He thought about this. He said, "I suppose they would." She said, "I'm sure they would." The structure stood on the Shasta County property after Agnes left. The family that bought the 25 acres in 1882 used it as a storage building for tools and feed, which was a reasonable adaptation of a structure that was still sound but too small for family habitation by the standards of a farm family with children. It was still standing in 1897 when the county assessor visited the property for a tax reassessment and noted it in his records as an outbuilding of unusual construction, earthen walls with an arched wooden-framed earthen roof. Estimated construction date, 1871. He wrote that it appeared structurally sound and showed no evidence of deterioration. He did not know who had built it or why it was shaped the way it was. He noted the arch form without noting what the arch form implied about the intelligence of the person who had chosen it. Agnes knew. She had understood the arch since 1867 in the hills north of the creek, and she had applied what she understood in the summer of 1871 when the pine cabin's north wall was rotting at the base and she needed a structure that would last. She built it small because she could heat a small space with less wood. She built the walls thick because thick walls hold heat better than thin ones. She built the roof as an arch because an arch carries snow load without failing, and because the shape sheds snow that accumulates on it. These were not innovations she had read about or been taught. They were observations she had made and conclusions she had drawn from the observations. Ezra had called it a burial mound. He had not been entirely wrong about the appearance. He had been entirely wrong about what the appearance indicated. In January of 1872, while the Webbs sat by her stove and the snow slid off the arch above them, she did not say this. She gave them tea and a place to sleep and sent them back to their own cabin when Ezra had it repaired. What she thought about it she kept to herself, which was her general practice with things she had been right about. The structure stood for what it was. The blizzard had been sufficient argument. The engineering principle Agnes applied, without naming it, without having studied it formally, was the arch, which is among the oldest structural inventions in human building and which solves a specific problem that no other form solves as efficiently. The problem it solves is this: how do you span a horizontal distance with a roof that can carry vertical load without requiring the spanning member to be thick enough to resist bending? A flat beam spanning 10 feet under a load of 2,000 pounds must be thick enough that the bending stress at its center does not exceed the tensile strength of the material. Timber has reasonable tensile strength. A 6-inch ponderosa pine beam can span 10 feet under modest loads, but its bending capacity decreases rapidly as the span increases or the load increases. Ezra Webb's cabin had a ridge beam spanning 20 feet under the load of 28 inches of snow, and the beam was not heavy enough for that combination of span and load. It cracked. An arch spanning the same 10 feet carries the same load entirely in compression. No part of the arch is in tension. No part of the arch is bending. The load at every point travels along the curve of the arch toward the supports at the base, where it arrives as a thrust, directed outward and downward. If the supports can resist that thrust, which sod walls absolutely can, because compressed earth is strong in compression, and the thrust of a 10-foot barrel arch over a 16-foot span is well within the capacity of 18-inch sod walls, then the arch carries the load without limit. A properly shaped arch over a properly supported span does not fail. it simply transfers load to the ground. Agnes's ribs were not stone. They were 1-inch pine boards, each spanning 5 feet from wall top to ridge and another 5 feet from ridge to the other wall top, bent in a curve that approximated a semicircle. Pine in bending is not as strong as pine in compression. She had replaced a beam that failed in bending with ribs that succeeded. In a modified form of compression, they were not perfectly in compression. The bent boards carried some bending stress as well as compression, particularly near the ridge where the curvature was sharpest. But the combination of the curve and the sod covering, which added weight that helped seat the ribs against the ridge beam and the wall tops, produced a structure that was substantially stronger than a flat-roofed alternative of the same materials. The specific failure of a flat roof under snow load follows a predictable sequence. Snow accumulates uniformly. The central span of the roof, the point farthest from the support at the walls, develops the highest bending moment, which is proportional to the load per unit length times the square of the span. As the snow accumulates, the bending moment increases. The beam deflects, bends downward at the center. If the deflection is visible before the beam fails, a person who knows what they are looking at can recognize the warning. If the beam is marginal, sized close to the limit of what the load and span require, the deflection may be small before failure and the crack may come quickly. This is what Agnes heard on the morning of the 17th, the sound of Ezra's ridge beam passing from deflection into fracture. The barrel arch fails differently. Under symmetric load, snow distributed evenly across the surface, the arch tends to deform at the quarter points rather than at the center. The quarter point is the location on a circular arch where the compression transitions from the upper half to the lower half of the arc, and under uniform load it is the point of maximum bending moment in an arch. But Agnes's structure had sod covering on the arch surface, and the sod added a dead load that was itself distributed along the arc. The self-weight of the arch and its covering, combined with the snow load, produced a load distribution that was closer to what engineers would later call the funicular curve. The shape a hanging chain takes under its own weight, which is also the ideal shape for an arch under that same weight. A barrel arch under its own dead load approaches its ideal load-bearing shape. Agnes had built the arch from ribs that approximated a semicircle, and the sod covering had added the distributed load that pushed the behavior of the arch closer to its optimal condition. She did not know this. She knew that it stood, and Ezra's roof cracked, and she knew the principle in the way a person knows a principle they have observed, rather than derived. The arch carries the weight, the snow slides off, the walls are strong in compression. This was sufficient knowledge to build the structure, and to explain its behavior in the terms she used. When Ezra asked whether she could have named the quarter-point bending moment, or the funicular curve, or the lateral thrust at the support is not the relevant question. The relevant question is whether she built a structure that worked, and she did. The winter people of the North Sacramento Valley and Trinity River watershed had been building semi-subterranean winter structures in the North California hills since before any European arrived in the region. Their winter houses were built on principles that the climate and available materials had shaped over centuries. The structure needed to retain heat against the cold nights of the North California winter. It needed to carry the weight of the earth covering without failing, and it needed to be buildable from the materials available in the mixed conifer and oak woodland of the foothills. The bent pole frame covered with bark and earth was the answer the Wintu had developed to this set of constraints. The poles, typically young willow or hazel, flexible enough to be bent into an arc without splitting, were set in the ground around the perimeter of the excavated pit and bent inward to meet above the center. Horizontal poles were woven through the verticals to complete the frame. Bark sheets were laid over the frame, overlapping. Then earth was piled on the bark and tamped to a consistent depth. The entrance was a low tunnel at one end, often facing south or southeast, to take advantage of the sun and to present the minimum opening to the prevailing northwest wind. Agnes had observed one of these structures in 1867 because a Winter family had built one near the creek where she drew water, and she had asked if she could look at it. The woman who showed it to her had explained, through the partial English communication that was possible at that time and place, that the shape shed the rain and the snow. She demonstrated by pressing her hands together in an inverted V. The rain goes to the sides. Agnes had understood. The principle was the same as the statement she made to Martha Webb 5 years later. The arch redirects the weight. The Wintu had been redirecting the weight of California winters for generations. and Agnes had the intelligence to recognize what the redirection meant. The specific window structure she saw was larger than what she built, 12 or 14 feet across versus her 10, and lower in profile, closer to a hemisphere than a barrel vault. Her adaptation was shaped by the materials she had. Pine boards that bent readily into a barrel profile but would have required more careful treatment to form a hemispherical cap, and the 16-foot length of the building that suited the barrel vault better than a round plan. The specific form was hers. The principle was the windows. She told the Shasta City merchant in September of 1871 that the windows had been here longer than the settlers. This was accurate in every sense that mattered. They had been in the North California hills for a time that dwarfed the 20 years of the American mining and farming presence, and they had spent those years developing practical knowledge of the climate and the materials. The arched winter house was part of that knowledge. Agnes had observed it, understood it, and applied it to her own materials and needs. The result was the barrel vault sod structure that stood on her Shasta County property for at least 11 years and possibly longer. The wood she burned in the structure during the winter of 1871–72 was valley oak, Quercus lobata, which was the primary hardwood fuel species in the Sacramento Valley foothills and which was available on her own property in the oak woodland above the creek. Valley oak is a heavy hardwood with a specific gravity of approximately 0.65 and a heat content of approximately 23 million BTU per cord when seasoned, similar in energy content to the post oak of the Oklahoma and Kansas plains. She had 3.5 cords cut and split and stacked in the lintel she built against the east end of the barrel vault structure before the first winter. The 2-cord consumption she achieved through the winter of 1871–72 versus the 3.5-cord consumption in the last winter she tracked in the pine cabin represented a reduction of approximately 40%. This reduction came from 2 sources in roughly equal proportion: the smaller volume to heat 160 square feet versus the 168 of Patrick's cabin, plus the vaulted ceiling that added volume at the center, and the substantially better insulation of the sod walls and roof. The thermal calculation for the 2 structures illustrates the difference. The rate of heat loss through a wall is proportional to the temperature difference between inside and outside, and inversely proportional to the thermal resistance, the R value of the wall material. Pine board at 1 inch has a thermal resistance of approximately R 1.25 per inch, giving Patrick's cabin walls an R value of approximately R 1.25 for the 1-inch boards. The sod walls of Agnes's structure at 18 inches had an R value of approximately R 18 to R 20, depending on the moisture content of the sod. Wet sod conducts heat more readily than dry sod, and the sod walls would have varied between these values across the season. The ratio is approximately 15:1 in favor of the sod walls. For a given temperature difference between inside and outside, Patrick's cabin lost heat approximately 15 times faster through its walls than Agnes's structure. This did not mean Agnes burned 15 times less wood. The floor, the door, and the stovepipe were heat loss paths that were roughly similar in both structures, and there were other variables, but it meant that the walls contributed minimally to the heat loss and that the stove could maintain a given interior temperature with a fraction of the fuel the pine cabin required. On the night of January 17, 1872, when the temperature outside was 14 degrees and Ezra Webb's family was sleeping on the platform inside Agnes's structure, the stove was burning a moderate load of split valley oak and the interior was 62 degrees. The temperature difference between inside and outside was 48 degrees. Through the 18-inch sod walls, this temperature difference drove a heat loss rate of approximately 3 BTU per hour per square foot. Through the 1-inch pine walls of Ezra's cabin, which he had repaired to the extent possible before bringing his family to Agnes's, the same temperature difference would have driven a heat loss of approximately 5 BTU per hour per square foot, 15 times higher. The Webbs were warm because Agnes had built the right walls and the right roof. The right walls and the right roof had cost her $4.60 at the Shasta City Mill in the summer of 1871. This was the full cost of being warm. The question of what the structure looked like, why it invited the comparison Ezra made, was a fair question and worth addressing separately from the question of how it worked. It looked like a burial mound, because burial mounds are also earth-covered structures of modest elevation, with a curved profile and an entrance opening at one end. The structural similarity between a burial mound and a barrel vault sod house is not coincidental. Both are responses to the same engineering constraint, which is how to form a stable earth-covered enclosure when the available building material is earth itself. Earth in compression, earth piled and tamped and settled, is structurally capable only when it is in compression, which means it can be stacked vertically, and it can be built over a curved form that keeps it in compression. A flat earth roof over a span of 10 feet would require the earth itself to span the distance, which it cannot do. Earth has no tensile strength, and a flat earth roof over 10 feet would collapse immediately. The curved form is not optional. Any earth-covered structure of modest construction cost must be curved, and any curved earth-covered structure will look something like the burial mounds that cultures around the world built. For the same reason, not because they were deliberately imitating burial mounds, but because the physics of earth construction lead to the same form independently. Agnes understood this implicitly when she looked at the winter houses and recognized the same curved form that she associated with the burial mounds of the Ohio country she had grown up in. The Ohio Hopewell mounds, which she had seen as a child, were not houses, they were ceremonial structures, but the form was related. Piled earth over a frame. The curve was the structure. She had seen it in Ohio in a ceremonial context and in the Shasta County hills in a domestic context, and had understood that the curve was doing the same thing in both places. What Ezra saw when he looked at Agnes's structure was the shape without the principle. He saw the low curved mound and the single entrance and associated it with the funerary use of the form he knew from his own experience in the Ohio country. Because he and Agnes were both from Ohio and both knew the Hopewell mounds, the association was reasonable as a visual identification. It was wrong as an engineering assessment. A burial mound and a barrel vault sod house look similar for the same reason. Two solutions to the same problem look similar. The problem constrains the solution. Agnes did not explain this to Ezra in August of 1871 when he made the comment. She said it would be warmer than his place in January, which was the relevant information, and left the question of why for January to answer. January answered it. The 9 winters Agnes spent in the barrel vault sod structure, from October 1871 to the spring of 1881 when she left for Sacramento, gave her a detailed record of the structure's behavior through the full range of Shasta County winter conditions, from the mild years when frost was the worst of it, to the severe years like 1872 and the storms of 1876 when heavy snow came twice in a single January. She kept the temperature record throughout, a morning reading before the first fire, a noon reading, an evening reading after the stove had been burning for 4 hours. The morning readings were the most informative because they showed what the walls and roof had preserved through the coldest part of the night without the stove's active contribution. Over 9 winters, the coldest morning reading she recorded was 42 degrees in February of 1876, when the outside temperature had been 7 degrees the night before. The warmest morning she had started a fire in 8°. Outdoor temperature was 44 degrees. In January of 1872, during the blizzard, the range of morning minima across 9 winters, 42 to 49 degrees, showed the consistency of the structure's thermal performance. The sod walls and arched roof maintained interior temperatures within a narrow band, regardless of the outdoor cold, because the thermal mass of the walls absorbed the daytime fire's heat and released it slowly through the night. This thermal mass behavior was the fourth advantage of the structure, alongside the snow load distribution, the insulation value, and the smaller volume to heat. Thermal mass and insulation value are related but distinct properties. Insulation value, R value, describes how slowly heat flows through a material. Thermal mass heat capacity describes how much heat a material can store per unit of weight. The sod walls had both high insulation value because of their thickness and the air pockets in the organic fraction of the soil, and high thermal mass because of the large volume of dense clallam material. A fire burning for 4 hours in the evening loaded heat into the walls. The walls released that heat slowly through the following night, maintaining the interior temperature above freezing even when the outdoor temperature dropped well below it. Patrick's pine cabin had neither of these properties in significant measure. 1 inch of pine board has low thermal mass. It stores almost no heat and low insulation value for the same reason. The cabin cooled rapidly after the evening fire died down because there was nothing in the walls to hold the heat. Agnes had recorded mornings in Patrick's cabin at 31 degrees after overnight lows of 23 degrees outside. The wall had allowed almost all of the indoor-outdoor temperature difference to equalize by morning. In her sod structure, the same outdoor overnight low produced an interior morning temperature of 47 degrees, a difference of 16 degrees attributable entirely to what the walls were made of. The wood savings compounded over 9 winters. If the reduction from 3.5 cords to 2 cords held across all 9 winters, and her records suggested it did, with minor variation between mild and severe years, she had burned approximately 13.5 cords less wood than the pine cabin would have required. At the Shasta County price of $4 per cord in 1872, which declined to $3.50 by the late 1870s, as more firewood came to market, the cumulative saving was approximately $50 to $54. This was 13 times the $4.60 she had paid for the ridge beam timber, which was the only money she had spent on the construction. She did not perform this calculation during the 9 winters. She kept the temperature records and the wood consumption records because she was a person who tracked the practical outcomes of practical decisions, not because she was building a case for the structure's economic superiority. The case was implicit in the records. She did not need to make it explicitly, because she was not trying to convince anyone. The structure was there. The records were there. The warmth was there. Agnes left Shasta County in the spring of 1881 under the specific pressure of her sons, concern and the general pressure of age. She was 53. She had been farming 25 acres alone for 13 years since Patrick's death, and Thomas had made the argument that Sacramento had better medical care and that he and James could see to her needs more easily if she were in the city. She accepted the argument without enthusiasm, but with the recognition that it was not wrong. She spent the last winter in the barrel vault sod structure, the winter of 1882-81, her 9th, with the same attention she had given the previous 8. She recorded the temperatures and the wood consumption and noted in the margin of the temperature record, beside the February entries, that the structure was in the same condition as it had been in October of 1871 when she moved in. No settling of the walls, no sagging of the arch, no cracking of the ribs. The sod that had been 6 inches of loose blocks in the summer of 1871 had, over 9 years of wet-dry cycling, consolidated into something closer to hard adobe, dense, stable, more resistant to erosion than the original cut sod. She pressed her palm against the south wall exterior on a February morning in 1881, and the surface felt like the fired earth of a kiln. It had become, over 9 winters, something harder and more permanent than what she had built from. Thomas came in April and they packed the house together. The temperature records went into the trunk, along with the farm accounts and Patrick's letters and the other papers she had maintained since 1855. Thomas looked at the records while he was packing them, the columns of morning temperatures across 9 winters, and said, "You recorded all of this." She said, "Every day." He said, "Did you show anyone?" She said, "Ezra saw the first winter's records when I told him what I'd tracked." He said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said it was impressive." Thomas said, "Just impressive." Agnes said, "He's not a man who says more than what he means." Thomas thought about this. He said, "He built a heavier ridge beam in 1872. She said, "Yes." He said, "Because of January." She said, "Yes." Thomas looked at the records for another moment and put them in the trunk. He said, "These should be somewhere that keeps them." She said, "There'll be somewhere that keeps them." He closed the trunk. The family that bought the property in 1882, the Hargrove family, from Siskiyou County, used the barrel vault sod structure as storage for the first years, and then, when they outgrew their main cabin, let the eldest son live in it for 2 years while the new house was being built on the south end of the property. The county assessor's 1897 note on the structure, earthen walls with an arched wooden-framed earthen roof, estimated construction date 1871, appears structurally sound, was the last specific record of its condition that has been found. Whether it stood beyond 1897 is not established. What is established is what Agnes knew and how she knew it. The winter houses in the North California hills, the curved form that made them stand under the weight of the earth and the snow, the Ohio morning in 1828 when, as a child, she first saw the curved mounds of the Hopewell people and asked what made them that shape. The answer she was given that was probably inadequate to the question she was really asking, and the Shasta County afternoon in 1867 when she looked at the winter house and understood that the curve was the answer and that the answer was old. She built it in the summer of 1871. It stood for at least 11 years after she built it, and probably longer. It was warm. The arch carried the snow. January of 1872 was sufficient demonstration of both facts. Ezra had called it a burial mound. The comparison was accurate, in the same way all useful comparisons are accurate. It named a real similarity in service of a wrong conclusion. The form was similar because the problem was similar. The problem was how to cover a space with earth without the earth falling in. The solution was the arch. The Hopewell people had found the arch. The Winto people had found the arch. Agnes had looked at what the Winto had found and applied it to pine boards and Shasta County sod in the summer of 1871. The blizzard of January 1872 was not a surprise to the structure. The structure had been built for exactly that condition. The arch carried the load. The walls held the heat. The webs were warm. This was the account. The morning she left Shasta County, she stood outside the barrel vault structure. For a few minutes before Thomas brought the wagon around, the April light was coming across the hill from the east, and the structure's curved profile caught it the same way it had caught every morning for 9 winters. A low, rounded shape against the hillside. The sod on the arch surface, showing the new spring green of the grass that came up through the old sod each April and died back in the summer, and came up again the following spring. The structure looked like part of the hill. It had always looked like part of the hill. This was the quality that the people who saw it as an improvisation had read as poverty, and that Agnes had understood as adequacy. A structure that was made of the hillside, and that looked like the hillside, was a structure that the hillside would continue to support for as long as it stood. She had made it from what was there. It had lasted because of what it was made from. She got in the wagon and went to Sacramento. The structure stayed.